So they reintroduced the idea of having a UN convention. And in 2001, in December of 2001, Mexico put forward a resolution to the United Nations General Assembly, so their main body, and suggested that the United Nations explore the development of a UN convention specifically on the rights of people with disabilities. And the UN agreed. They said this is a good idea. And they established what we call an ad hoc committee. And ad hoc means sort of one-off. So it was a one-time committee designed to look at this one particular issue. And throughout 2002 to 2006, that ad hoc committee met 8 times. There was a working group that met early days to kind of pull together a bit of a draft text that people could begin to look at. And from the outset, it was an interesting group of people who were part of that ad hoc committee. Who do you think would be part of the committee? If you're at the United Nations and you had an ad hoc committee group. Do you think countries would be on that? Yeah. Do you think those delegations are usually lawyers, diplomats, ambassadors, people from foreign affairs? Does that kind of make sense? Who would be on that? There's also a body called National Institutes for Human Rights. National Human Rights Institutes. Had that switched around. And those would be groups like the Canadian Human Rights Commission and other international or other countries that have human rights commissions. Does it kind of make sense that they would be part of international negotiations on human rights? Yeah, I think so too. But for the first time ever, there was another group that was part of that ad hoc committee. And that was us. It was civil society. It was people like you and me who work for disability organizations. It's people with disabilities themselves. It was family members who were there in New York as part of those negotiations and making sure that our lived experience, our voices, our knowledge were part of the words that became international law. That's a really big change for the United Nations, to actually have individuals who are directly affected by a convention that engaged in making it real. So that happened between 2002 and 2006. In December of 2006, the United Nations General Assembly, so again, their big body, formally adopted the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It was open for signature on March 30th of 2007, and I'll talk a little bit about what some of those terms mean in a while. On May 3rd of 2008, it became international law. You have to have a certain number of countries ratify it and say that they legally agree to it before you can say it's international law. So May 3rd of 2008, and on March 10th, 2011, a little bit later than we would like, Canada finally became one of those countries who ratified the convention. Now, it's a convention of many firsts. It's a unique convention for a number of reasons, and it accomplished many things that no other convention has. It is the first human rights treaty of the 21st century. It is the fastest negotiated human rights convention in UN history. So from 2001, when the proposal went through, to 2006, when they formally adopted it, to 2007, when they opened it up for signature, is the equivalent of lightning speed at the United Nations. Nothing moves that fast at the UN. So this was a really clear momentum building experience. People were excited about it, and it's moved forward really, really quickly. As I said, it's the first time in history civil society actively participated. It's the first human rights convention with an explicit social development dimension that looks explicitly at the issues around what it means to have rights realized. It isn't just a listing of rights that you can hold up and say, I have a right to this. It actually walks through what is required to make those rights real, which is a pretty big shift for human rights law. And when the convention was opened for signature in March of 2007, 82 countries signed on that first day. And that's the biggest number of countries to sign on to a convention on opening day in UN history. So again, demonstrating the, I think, excitement about this, the commitment to this on a global scale. And interestingly, for our Canadian audience, It's the first time that Canada has ever signed a convention on opening day. We've signed and ratified most conventions, that is part of our history, but it hadn't happened before on opening day, and we made that happen. You guys made that happen. Our movement made that happen. Canada had told us they were not going to sign on opening day. It was too hard, they had too much work to do, they still had to talk to the provinces, and we as a movement joined with the broader disability community and said, no, that is not okay. We need to be at the table, we need to be there on opening day. And at the time, our Minister of Foreign Affairs was Peter MacKay, who lives in Nova Scotia. And his riding in Nova Scotia was inundated, absolutely inundated. They got letters, faxes, emails, people coming into his office in near Pictou, people calling his Hill office, saying, you know, Peter, step up. We need to make this happen. And they did, which is a great lesson about the power of our own voices. So I've talked a bit about why we need a UN convention, some of the unique things this convention accomplished, and that's quite a bit of prestige for one little convention to carry. And the reason I think it accomplished a number of those things is because it's a different convention. It's unlike any human rights document we've ever seen before. And I'll walk through a bit why I think it's different. So one, participatory. I talked about how this is the first time civil society's been actively involved. And boy, were we involved. So this is a picture of the main room in the United Nations where we did all the negotiating. In the middle area here along these main tables are the government delegations. Government delegations were interesting to watch as they evolved over the process. So at the beginning, they tended to be lawyers, diplomats, people from their foreign affairs department, people involved in international human rights law. A couple of them had some direct representation of people with disabilities on them. By the end of it, all of them had representation from people with disabilities on their delegations. We also had, sort of sitting around the other parts of the room, those members of civil society, you and me, our organizations, our international organizations, who were there negotiating with other countries. By our last negotiating session, we had more than 800 civil society members registered and accredited to participate in New York. It had a huge impact on this convention. It was because people could hear stories and meet people and learn and understand how law and how our practices have created exclusion, have created isolation, have institutionalized people, have discriminated against people. And being able to share those stories changes minds. We all know that. When you get your story out there, people really can better understand what happens. It put a name and a face to exclusion. It also meant the UN had to figure out accommodation and inclusion on the fly. So think of the United Nations building. It was built sort of early 1940s in New York. Hasn't had much work done to it since then, to be honest. We were negotiating in the basement of the United Nations building. We've got people in wheelchairs that have to get down there, and they still have those old elevators that are operated by an elevator operator, and you can fit like 2 people in there. They had to figure out that. They had to figure out the United Nations hands out more paper than you can imagine. Every time anyone says anything on the floor, it has to be documented. And everyone's got to get a piece of paper. There are forests who have been destroyed over this, I am sure. But they suddenly had to figure out, how do we get this out in alternative print? How do we get this out in Braille? How do we manage to ensure that people are being included? We had to ensure that people were using plain language. I invite you to ask a group of lawyers talking about technical issues related to legal capacity to use plain language. But they had to figure that out, and for the most part, they did. Even the UN cafeteria suddenly had to figure out what it meant to ensure that they were being inclusive and that they had room in the cafeteria. So it was that real transformative impact